So what is batching versus consent? Well, so for those of you who have tuned into assembly floor sessions, particularly during deadline weeks, you may hear the term batching or batching of bills. What does that mean and how does it compare to the consent calendars? So batching in the assembly basically means putting together a group of bills for consideration in a single motion or a single vote. And essentially, how the assembly does it reviews recommendations of both the Democratic and Republican caucuses. And where appropriate, the staff batches together a group of bills in order for legislators, assembly members, to take a single vote on that batch or grouping of bills. So the first requirement is that both party caucuses have a support recommendation on these bills. And the second requirement, naturally, is that both parties agree to the measures that are included, that are batched together, because in batching them into a single vote, there won't be any debate or discussion on the floor of the assembly. So, how does this batching process differ from the consent calendar? Well, there are more specific rules related to measures proposed for the consent calendar. For example, there's three rules under the joint rules. Joint Rule 22.1 deals with consent calendar uncontested bills. And for that, it provides that each standing committee may report an uncontested bill out of committee with the recommendation that it be placed on the consent calendar if three requirements are met: that it pass the committee by a unanimous vote, that there's no opposition expressed at the committee hearing itself, and that it's been requested by the author to be placed on consent. The next is Joint Rule 22.2, which is titled Consent Calendar. And this provides that following a second reading and the adoption of any committee amendments, that a bill that's been certified by the committee chair as an uncontested bill can be placed on the consent calendar. And so this is a consent calendar bill. And of course, any legislator can object to a bill being placed on the consent calendar. And these bills are considered on the second legislative day following the day that the bill was placed on the consent calendar. So you'll see in the daily file of the Assembly and Senate, first consent, first legislative day, and consent, second legislative day. They actually vote on it on the second legislative day, absent a rule waiver or rule suspension. Joint Rule 22.3 deals with the consideration of bills on the consent calendar, and it says that a bill on consent is not debatable, and it's generally considered the last order of business on the daily file, although sometimes that is not observed. The Assembly utilizes one consent calendar, Assembly Rule 56.7, which deals with the consent calendar, requires that if the chair of a committee in advance of a hearing proposes to recommend any bills for consideration on the consent calendar, that means there's no hearing testimony on those bills. And that list of bills on the consent calendar has to be made available to the public at the same time that the committee analysis is required to be posted. Now, Assembly Rule 71 deals with so-called uncontested bills, and it specifies that a bill may not be placed on the Assembly consent calendar unless it's met the requirements of Joint Rule 22.1, which we discussed earlier on uncontested bills. And that is in regard to every Assembly standing committee to which the bill was referred. So the basic rule here is that the committee places the bill on the consent calendar. The Senate, on the other hand, uses both a consent calendar and what it calls a special consent calendar. So Senate Rule 28.3 deals with the consent calendar in that House. And it provides that if a Senate bill or an Assembly bill is amended in the Senate to either create a new bill or to rewrite the bill, then the standing committee cannot place that bill on the consent calendar. So the Senate basically operates its main consent calendar similar to the Assembly's. However, in addition to that consent calendar, the Senate also utilizes what it calls a special consent calendar. And the requirement for the bill to be on the Senate special consent calendar is that there's no registered opposition to the bill and that both party caucuses have a support recommendation on that bill. And the special consent calendar is designated with a date upon which the measures will actually be voted on by the Senate. So in essence, the Assembly's use of batching is similar to the Senate's use of its special consent calendar.